Rain hammered Manhattan with unrelenting force, transforming the avenues into rivers of neon and glass. Headlights smeared across puddles, sirens wailed in the distance, and umbrellas tilted against the wind as strangers hurried past. At the center of this storm stood Adrian Cole, 34 years old, the youngest billionaire CEO once praised as the future of American business. Hours earlier, he had signed his resignation letter each stroke of the pen, sealing the death of the empire he had built from nothing. The ink had barely dried when the boardroom doors closed behind him, and silence swallowed what used to be his world. Now he emerged into the chaos of the city, stripped of everything his tailored suit, clinging wetly to his frame. His tie loosened as if choking him, his once sharp hair plastered against his forehead. Cameras flashed from across the street, the paparazzi, risking the downpour to capture the fallen titan. Their voices cut through the rain with ruthless eagerness. "Adrian, how does it feel to lose everything? Do you regret trusting your wife? Are you finished for good?" None of them cared for answers. They wanted blood, and he had already bled. Headlines the next morning would not speak of his vision or innovation, but of his downfall. From king to nobody, the captions would read. And perhaps they were right, for the weight in his chest confirmed he was no longer the man who once lit up magazine covers. His empire had not been stolen by competitors or markets. It had been betrayed from within. Cassandra, the woman he had loved since his early 20s, the woman who had once kissed him under strings of college lights, had sold her shares and her vows in a single calculated move. Worse than the board's decision was the sight of her standing with his attorney fingers intertwined as she announced his recklessness, his instability, his failure. Love had never been part of the marriage he realized now. It had been a contract of ambition, and in betraying him, she had signed its final clause. The storm seemed to know his anguish, pressing its cold fingers against his skin, until he could no longer tell if he was shaking from rain or rage. He walked aimlessly through the city that once adored him, leather shoes sinking in flooded gutters. His heart hollowed out until even his breath felt foreign. He did not notice the passers-by or the taxis spraying sheets of water. He noticed only the absence of everything that once defined him. His wealth gone, his company stolen, his marriage shattered, his future erased. He stopped at the corner of Lexington Avenue, where a cafe window glowed softly against the night, its light a fragile promise of warmth. But he did not enter. He stood beneath the streetlight face, tilted toward the rain eyes vacant. Water traced down his jaw and into his collar, as though the storm itself sought to drown him. In that instant, he wondered if disappearing into the anonymity of the crowd would be easier than facing the humiliation of survival. Then above the hiss of the rain, a voice reached him. "Sir, you will catch your death out here." It was not a shout, but a gentle call, hesitant yet steady. Adrian turned slowly. A young woman stood a few feet away, clutching an umbrella that trembled under the wind. She wore a cafe apron tied over faded jeans, the name tag on her chest smudged with rain. Her chestnut hair clung to her cheeks, but her eyes, brown and unguarded, held a warmth that pierced through the storm. She must have just finished her shift, but instead of rushing home, she paused for him. "Do you need a place to sit?" she asked softly, her voice uncertain but sincere. "My cafe is still open for staff. You could dry off for a while." Adrian stared at her in disbelief. For days he had faced only betrayal, indifference, and pity. Yet this stranger offered kindness without knowing who he was. She did not see a disgraced billionaire or a tabloid headline. She saw a man soaked to the bone standing alone. His throat tightened as if the words had been waiting years to be spoken, but now refused to come. The umbrella tilted, shielding his face from the rain, and for the first time since the collapse, he felt something other than despair. Her name, he would soon learn, was Sophie Miller. She worked late shifts at the cafe to cover rent in a cramped apartment in Queens. She had no fortune, no press, no board of directors. What she had was sincerity and the courage to speak to a stranger whose silence screamed louder than the storm. Beneath the trembling edge of her umbrella, their eyes met. The world slowed. Neon light reflected in their gaze, raindrops suspended between them like fragile glass. A billionaire betrayed and alone. A poor girl offering shelter with nothing but a voice and a fragile umbrella. In that collision of worlds, at that corner in the rain, something irreversible began. The cameras, the betrayals, the empty streets faded. Only her question remained, hanging in the air like a lifeline. And though Adrian did not yet know it, the path from ruin to redemption had just opened before him. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and faint cinnamon, a modest warmth against the storm outside. Sophie guided Adrian to a corner booth, the vinyl seat torn at one edge, the table scarred by years of cups and plates. To Adrian, who had dined beneath chandeliers and crystal glasses, the space might have once seemed ordinary, even forgettable. Yet now, after the boardroom betrayal, it felt like refuge. Sophie slipped behind the counter with an ease born of routine. She poured coffee from the pot reserved for staff and set it before him without asking. The steam rose between them, curling upward, as though trying to bridge the silence. Adrian wrapped his hands around the chipped mug, the heat seeping into his chilled skin. He took a sip, the bitterness cutting through the fog in his head. It was the cheapest coffee he had ever tasted, but in that moment it carried a comfort. His penthouse espresso machine never could. Sophie leaned her hip against the counter, studying him without prying. She saw not the billionaire splashed across headlines, but a man weighed down by shadows. His suit was immaculate in tailoring but ruined by the rain, his posture both commanding and broken. Something about the way his eyes avoided hers told her he was carrying a storm, inside far heavier than the one outside. She asked nothing about his life. Instead, she spoke about hers, filling the air with gentle stories of customers she had served, of her roommate's cat that stole socks of the elderly man who came every morning at 7 sharp for a blueberry muffin. Her voice was light, unassuming, the kind that offered companionship without demand. Adrian listened in silence, letting her words wash over him like balm. It struck him that no one in years had spoken to him this way. Conversations in his world had always been transactions layered with expectation, deals dressed as dialogue. Cassandra had spoken in terms of acquisitions and appearances, never in tales of cats or muffins. For the first time in years, Adrian felt as though he was not required to perform. He could sit soaked and hollow and simply be. Hours passed unnoticed. The cafe closed to the public, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Sophie refilled his cup without asking, each pour a quiet act of care. When the storm finally broke, she fetched a towel from the back and handed it to him. He hesitated before accepting, unaccustomed to such gestures without strings. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice low, almost rusty. It was the first word he had spoken since entering. She smiled the kind of smile that was neither forced nor calculated, but genuine. "You are welcome." The night ended with her offering him shelter until the rain cleared, and though Adrian declined, he left with something unexpected. He carried her voice with him through the empty streets, the memory of warmth that no fortune had ever bought him. In the days that followed, Adrian returned. At first it was by chance, then by choice. He found himself walking past the cafe long after midnight, when neon signs buzzed against empty sidewalks. Sophie would be there cleaning tables or counting tips, and she would greet him with a nod, as though his presence was ordinary. She never asked why he came. She never probed into his past. She treated him as though he were simply a man who enjoyed late-night coffee. That small mercy became his lifeline. The newspapers grew harsher each day. Articles called him the fallen genius, the reckless spender, the man too blinded by ego to see betrayal coming. Cassandra appeared in glossy spreads, her hand entwined with her new lover. Her lips curved in victorious laughter. Adrian could not escape the spectacle of his humiliation. Yet within the walls of the cafe, none of it mattered. Sophie did not mention the headlines. She did not hint that she recognized his face from the news. Perhaps she did not watch, or perhaps she chose silence as kindness. Either way, it gave Adrian something he had not felt since childhood anonymity. He was not Adrian Cole the billionaire. He was simply a man with tired eyes who ordered the cheapest coffee. Over time, their conversations deepened. Sophie spoke of her dream to teach underprivileged children, of her desire to create a small community space where kids could learn music, art, and language without worrying about cost. She confessed how tips barely covered rent, how her father's illness had left debts she was still paying. She laughed at herself for dreaming so big while living so small. Adrian listened astonished. Here was a woman who owned nothing yet, still carried hope. He realized how long it had been since he had listened to anyone without calculating advantage. Her vision stirred something buried within him, a part of himself he thought Cassandra had killed. He wanted to help not out of obligation, but out of genuine belief. One evening, as rain tapped lightly against the windows, Adrian asked if she had ever written her ideas down. Sophie shook her head, embarrassed. "Who would listen to me?" Adrian leaned forward, his eyes sharper than they had been in weeks. "I would. Write them down. Let me see them." She blinked, surprised by his intensity. "But you are just a customer." He shook his head. "Not tonight. Tonight I am someone who believes in you." She smiled faintly, and something in that smile filled the hollow inside him. Each night afterward, they worked together at the corner booth. Sophie scribbled plans in a worn notebook, outlining classes, volunteers, and potential spaces. Adrian, thou stripped of his empire, still carried the mind of a strategist. He guided her on structure, on feasibility, on the art of transforming vision into possibility. For the first time since his fall, he felt useful again. And Sophie, in her quiet way, gave him purpose without even knowing his name had once lit up Wall Street. Their bond grew in the silence between words, in the comfort of shared coffee, in the slow recognition that broken souls sometimes mend each other. Outside the world still mocked Adrian Cole. Inside the cafe, Sophie Miller reminded him that ruin was not the end. It was the beginning of something entirely new. Morning in Manhattan rarely granted mercy, And for Adrian Cole, it arrived with headlines bold enough to scorch his name across every street corner. The tabloids screamed with words like "fallen genius" and "billionaire betrayed," while glossy magazines printed photographs of Cassandra radiant in designer coats, her hand entwined with the man who had once been Adrian's trusted attorney. They painted her as the victim, claiming Adrian's recklessness and arrogance had doomed Cole Global, and they framed her new partner as the savior who rescued her from a toxic marriage. Adrian sat in the corner booth of Sophie's cafe, the same chipped table that had become his haven, and watched customers glance at their phones with snickers. They thought he did not notice, but he did. The weight of disgrace pressed harder than the rain ever had. Sophie carried a tray of pastries past him and paused when she caught the tension in his jaw. She had begun to recognize the subtle signs of his inner storms. The way his hand clenched around a coffee cup, the way his eyes fixed on a point far away. Without a word, she slid a blueberry muffin onto his table. On the house, she whispered before moving on. Adrian lowered his gaze to the muffin, the same kind she had once mentioned an elderly man ordered daily. Somehow the simple gesture unraveled him more than any headline could. Later that afternoon, his phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, each one dripping with insincere sympathy. One text read, "I am so sorry, Adrian, but you should have seen it coming." Another simply said, "You are toxic now. Stay away." He deleted them all. When he finally dared to open the news, he saw Cassandra seated beside the attorney during a television interview. Her voice steady as she claimed Adrian had been spiraling for months. He was obsessed with expansion. She said he ignored warning signs he was dangerous to his own legacy. Adrian felt rage rise like a tide, but beneath it was something worse. A hollow ache that whispered she had never loved him. Sophie found him outside the cafe that evening, his fists clenched against the brick wall knuckles white. She placed a hand on his arm, and he flinched, expecting judgment, but her eyes carried no scorn. She did not mention the news. Instead, she said, "You look like you need air. Come walk with me." They walked down streets lined with steaming vents and honking taxis. Adrian spoke little, but Sophie's silence felt like a shelter, stronger than walls. At last he broke. "She sold me," he said hoarsely. "Not just the company, me. She sold every promise we ever made." Sophie listened without interruption, her footsteps steady beside his. And when he finally stopped, his breath ragged, she looked at him with quiet conviction. "Then she never deserved you." The words were simple, yet they struck deeper than any grand speech. Adrian stopped walking, stunned by the certainty in her voice. All week he had been told he was a failure, reckless, doomed. But Sophie, a woman with no reason to defend him, declared otherwise. The city lights glowed against her face, and for a moment Adrian felt the faintest flicker of something he had buried hope. Days turned to weeks, and the public collapse only grew louder. Protesters gathered outside his former headquarters. Investors demanded explanations, and Cassandra flaunted her new life with merciless pride. Reporters camped near his old penthouse, though he no longer lived there, and articles speculated he had vanished into shame. In truth, Adrian spent his nights in the cafe or wandering streets until dawn, finding in Sophie the only person who did not treat him as a fallen spectacle. One night, a television in the corner blared another segment about his downfall. Customers leaned closer, whispering as the anchor described him as a man consumed by ego. Adrian stiffened, prepared to leave, but Sophie reached across the counter and switched the channel without comment. She then looked him directly in the eye and said, "You do not have to prove them wrong tonight. Sometimes it is enough to breathe." Something in her certainty anchored him. Adrian realized then that Sophie was not blind to who he was. She knew the truth, perhaps had known from the beginning, but chose to see him as a man instead of a headline. And that choice, repeated in every gesture and every silence, became the thread stitching his fractured pieces back together. The world outside labeled him a disgrace, a fool betrayed by ambition and love. Inside the cafe, Sophie's presence insisted otherwise. There, Adrian Cole was not the fallen billionaire. He was simply a man learning how to stand again. And though the storm of scandal raged louder each day, it could not drown the quiet power of one woman's belief. The cafe lights glowed dimly in the late hours, the hum of the refrigerator blending with the patter of rain against the glass. Adrian sat in his usual corner, staring at the steam rising from his mug. Sophie wiped down tables, her apron smudged with coffee stains, hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. The quiet felt different tonight, less like emptiness and more like waiting. She noticed the way his shoulders slumped, how he carried defeat like an invisible weight. Setting down her cloth, she slid into the booth across from him. "You never talk about what you want," she said softly. "Not what you lost, not what happened, just what you still want." Adrian blinked at her, startled. No one had asked him that since before Cassandra's betrayal. He opened his mouth, then shut it. The truth tasted foreign on his tongue. "I don't know any more. For years, everything I wanted was tied to the company, to her. Now it all feels hollow." Sophie folded her hands, thinking. She hesitated before speaking again, as though revealing a secret. "When I was a kid, I wanted to be a teacher. My mom worked double shifts, so books and teachers were my babysitters. But college was expensive, life got messy, and here I am carrying plates instead of lesson plans." She smiled faintly, but her eyes shimmered with something unspoken. Adrian studied her, surprised by the raw honesty. "You would have been good at it," he said without thinking. Sophie tilted her head. "You don't know that." "I know enough," Adrian replied. "The way you explain things, the way you notice people, it matters." She looked down, embarrassed by the praise. After a moment, she said, "My dream now is smaller. I want to start a little program for kids in the neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a place where they can learn, maybe play piano or paint. A space where they feel safe, but I cannot even afford rent on my own, so it is ridiculous to think about." Her laugh was soft, self-deprecating. Adrian leaned forward. "It's not ridiculous, it is necessary." She blinked at the intensity in his tone. "I used to think everything needed to scale to dominate markets. But maybe what actually matters is this: one place, one community. You should write it down." Sophie laughed again, shaking her head. "Who would take me seriously?" Adrian's eyes hardened with a spark of the old fire that once drove him to build an empire. "I would." That night, Sophie fetched an old spiral notebook from her bag. Its cover was bent, the pages wrinkled, but to Adrian it looked like gold. Together they began sketching her dream. She listed activities, volunteers, schedules. Adrian corrected, expanded, asked sharp questions about resources. She answered as best she could, surprised at how serious he seemed. Hours passed unnoticed, the storm outside forgotten. It was the first time since his downfall that Adrian felt his mind sharpen for something beyond grief. And it was the first time Sophie allowed herself to believe her dream might hold weight. Over the following weeks, their midnight planning sessions became routine. Adrian arrived at closing time. Sophie brewed the cheapest coffee, and they bent over the notebook like conspirators. He showed her how to draft budgets, how to identify potential sponsors, how to set goals that would attract trust. She marveled at the precision of his mind, how quickly he cut through problems that had always overwhelmed her. In return, she grounded him. When he spiraled into jargon and projections, she reminded him of faces of children in need of the human heartbeat behind the numbers. Slowly, a partnership took shape. One evening, Sophie confessed more of her past. "My father was a mechanic. He worked until his hands gave out, but when he got sick, medical bills drowned us. I tried to juggle school and shifts, but when he passed, I had to choose survival over degrees. Sometimes I wonder if he would be disappointed." Adrian listened carefully before answering. No parent who sacrificed everything could be disappointed in a daughter who kept fighting. She bit her lip, eyes wet. "You talk like you know." Adrian's jaw tightened. "My father died when I was young too. Different cause, but same result. My mother raised me and my sister, working 3 jobs. I promised myself I would make enough money that no one I loved would ever struggle again." He laughed bitterly. "And look where that got me." Sophie reached across the table, resting her hand over his. "You tried. That matters more than the outcome." The contact was brief, but it sent a warmth through him that lingered long after she pulled away. As weeks turned into a month, Adrian began to notice changes within himself. He no longer woke each morning drowning in bitterness. Instead, he anticipated the nights at the cafe, the exchange of ideas, the laughter that slipped between planning sessions. Sophie's belief in him, quiet but unwavering, rebuilt something Cassandra had destroyed. Yet outside their bubble, the world remained cruel. Headlines grew louder, painting him as irredeemable. Cassandra flaunted her wealth, appearing at galas claiming she had rescued the company from his incompetence. Adrian watched from the sidelines, rage simmering, but Sophie's words steadied him. "Do not fight them on their battlefield. Build something new." That became his mantra. Together they refined the plan into a proposal. Sophie hesitated to call it anything, but Adrian insisted on naming it. Hope House, he suggested, a place for children who need light. She smiled, the name catching in her heart. "It sounds real now," she whispered. "It is real," Adrian replied firmly. In the quiet of the cafe, under the hum of fluorescent lights, they shared a look that carried the weight of promises unspoken. Trust had been planted like a seed, and though storms still raged outside, within that booth, 2 broken lives had begun to knit together, stitched by shared vision and fragile hope. Neither knew yet how far it would take them, but both understood one truth. Healing was no longer solitary. It had become a journey they would walk side by side. The night was quiet in the cafe, only the low hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Adrian sat with his hands clasped around a half-empty cup, his gaze unfocused on the swirl of liquid. Sophie sat across from him, her notebook closed. Sensing that tonight he was carrying more weight than usual. He had been restless during their planning, distracted, his answers clipped. Finally, she asked what had been pressing at her lips for days. What was she like, Cassandra? Adrian's jaw tightened at the name, but he did not look away. Instead, he leaned back against the worn booth and let out a long breath. She was dazzling, he began slowly. I met her when I was 21, just a kid with too many ideas and not enough money. She was older, sharper. She walked into a room, and people parted like she was gravity. And me, I was stupid enough to think she looked at me the same way I looked at her. He gave a bitter smile. At first, maybe she did. Back then, it felt like we were partners, building something together. She believed in my ideas, or at least she made me think she did. We married young, too young, but I thought it was love. He rubbed his forehead, eyes shadowed with memory. What I did not see was that for her, it was never about me. It was about power, about positioning herself at the center of a rising empire. Every dinner, every gala, every deal was just another move in her game. When we argued, it was always about appearances, never about us. When I was exhausted, she told me to work harder. When I wanted children, she told me they would ruin her figure and distract from her social calendar. His voice broke slightly. And when I thought we had made it when the company was at its peak, that is when she left. She sold me Sophie. Not just the shares, not just the boardroom. She sold every word we ever spoke in private, every dream I ever confessed. She sold me for more prestige and the arm of a man who knew my weaknesses. His hands trembled as he spoke, and Sophie reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. Adrian's eyes flicked to hers, filled with torment. Do you know what it feels like to realize the person you trusted most never loved you? She squeezed his hand softly. I know what it feels like to wonder if anyone ever could. Adrian swallowed hard, the silence stretching. For a long time he had bottled his grief, burying it beneath anger. Now, with Sophie's eyes steady on him, the dam cracked. I spent years convincing myself that love was sacrifice, that working 16 hours a day was proof of devotion. I thought if I built something indestructible, she would see me, truly see me. But the truth is, she never wanted me. She wanted the empire. And when the empire was threatened, she discarded me like old stock. His voice broke completely, and he turned away, ashamed of the wetness in his eyes. Sophie, however, did not let go. She leaned closer, her voice calm. You are not weak for feeling. You are human. Adrian exhaled sharply, the sound almost a sob. I have not cried in 15 years, not since my father's funeral. Sophie smiled faintly. Then maybe it was long overdue. His chest shuddered, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to break. The tears came silently at first, then with force, his shoulders shaking as years of pride collapsed. Sophie did not speak, did not move, except to let her hand stay on his. The cafe around them was quiet, the world outside unaware of the man who once ruled boardrooms, now unraveling in a small booth. When the storm of his grief subsided, Adrian wiped his face with the back of his hand, ashamed. I am sorry, he muttered. You should not see me like this. Sophie shook her head firmly. No, you should not hide this. This is who you are not. The headlines, not the empire. This. A man who loved and lost, and is still standing. Her words cut through the shame, leaving something raw but clean. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw no judgment in her gaze. Only compassion, steady and unwavering. In that moment, something shifted within him. For years his heart had been encased in steel, armored against disappointment. Cassandra had taught him that love was conditional, transactional. But Sophie's quiet presence cracked the armor. She did not ask for anything. She simply stayed. That night, as they parted ways, Adrian walked into the cool air, feeling lighter despite the ache. The wounds were still there, jagged and deep, but for the first time, they felt like they could heal. And he knew with certainty it was because of her. The nights at the cafe grew longer, filled not only with stories and confessions, but with the scratch of pen against paper, the click of Sophie's old laptop keys, and the hushed excitement of ideas beginning to breathe. Adrian found himself leaning over Sophie's notebook with the same intensity he once reserved for million-dollar proposals. Yet this time, the stakes felt higher. It was not about market share or quarterly profits, but about creating something that mattered to people who had nothing. Sophie's dream of a community program for children had lingered like smoke, fragile and uncertain, until Adrian began to shape it with structure. He drew charts on napkins, outlined phases on the back of receipts, explaining concepts of funding partnerships and sustainability. Sophie watched with wide eyes, sometimes overwhelmed, sometimes amused at his intensity, but always encouraged by his unwavering focus on her vision. One evening, as the cafe emptied and the owner locked the front door, Adrian spread a set of notes across the table. "Look," he said, tapping the page. "If we start with just one location, something manageable, we can create a proof of concept. We do not need millions. We need a few thousand to secure a space, recruit volunteers, and buy supplies. Once we show results, people will invest." Sophie bit her lip, glancing at the numbers. "It looks so real when you write it like that." Adrian leaned back, eyes searching hers. "It is real, Sophie. All it needs is someone brave enough to believe in it." She hesitated, then whispered, "I am not brave. I am just a waitress with overdue bills." Adrian shook his head. "You are the bravest person I know. You faced loss and still dream. That is courage." She looked down, embarrassed, but her heart thudded with something she could not name. As days turned into weeks, their partnership deepened. Adrian taught her how to use spreadsheets, how to draft a pitch, how to speak with conviction. Sophie countered with reminders of humanity, of the children who would paint and play music, of the mothers who would finally have a safe place to leave their kids while working shifts. Adrian, who had once measured success in billions, began to see value in crayons and piano keys. But building something new was not easy. The first obstacle was money. Adrian's assets remained frozen, and no investor wanted to touch his name. Sophie offered her small savings the tips she had been hoarding for months. Adrian refused at first, unwilling to see her sacrifice, but she pressed the envelope into his hand. "If I do not believe in this, why should anyone else?" Reluctantly, he accepted his throat tight with gratitude. Together they rented a tiny back room in a community center, barely large enough for a handful of children. They painted the walls bright yellow, Sophie laughing as she splattered her jeans, Adrian rolling paint with unexpected skill. The smell of fresh paint clung to their clothes, but in that moment they felt like builders of a world reborn. When the first children arrived, clutching worn backpacks and hesitant smiles, Sophie knelt to greet them as though they were royalty. Adrian watched from the doorway, his chest tightening. He had once presented to presidents and investors, but nothing compared to the way these children looked at Sophie with trust. In that small room, among scattered crayons and mismatched chairs, Adrian glimpsed a new kind of empire. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Parents whispered about the free classes, about the tall man with sharp eyes, and the young woman with a gentle voice who had opened doors where none existed before. Volunteers trickled in, offering to teach music art and reading. The program began to grow faster than they anticipated. Adrian worked late into the night, drafting new budgets and outlines his old fire rekindled. Yet this time he was not building for shareholders or a boardroom. He was building for Sophie, for the children, for redemption. Sophie often found him asleep at the booth papers, scattered his head resting on folded arms. She would drape her jacket over his shoulders, watching him with quiet tenderness. One night she woke him gently. "You cannot save the world." In one night, she teased. Adrian smiled groggily. "No, but maybe we can save one block." As their project gained momentum, whispers reached the press. Reporters began to sniff around, curious about the fallen billionaire spending nights in a cafe and days in a community center. Adrian braced himself for another storm of ridicule. Instead, to his surprise, a small local paper ran a piece titled "From Boardroom to Classroom Disgraced." CEO builds hope with local waitress. The article painted them not as failures, but as dreamers. And for the first time since his collapse, Adrian saw a headline that did not crucify him. Sophie cut the article out and pinned it to the corkboard in their tiny office. "See," she said, "it is happening." He stared at the clipping, emotions swelling. This matters more than Forbes ever did. But challenges remained. Funding was tight. Landlords demanded rent, and Cassandra reappeared like a ghost. She sent him messages, dripping with mockery, hinting that he was wasting his brilliance on crayons and children. Adrian deleted them, but her shadow lingered. Sophie noticed his haunted expression and touched his hand. "She cannot take this from you unless you let her." Her words steadied him once more. Their bond deepened in those nights of struggle. Between painting walls, balancing budgets, and teaching children, they discovered laughter that had been buried for years. Sophie teased Adrian about his inability to handle glitter crafts, while he teased her about her fierce negotiating skills with suppliers. Beneath the banter lay something unspoken, but growing a warmth that neither dared to name. One evening after a long day, Sophie sat on the floor with crayons scattered around her, exhausted but smiling. Adrian lowered himself beside her, their shoulders brushing. She sighed, resting her head briefly against his arm. For the first time in years, Adrian did not feel the gnawing emptiness of betrayal. He felt alive, needed seen. He looked down at her, wanting to speak, to confess, but the words stuck. Instead, he whispered, "You have no idea what you have given me." Sophie lifted her head, eyes shining. "Maybe I do." The moment lingered fragile and charged before she rose to put away the crayons. Adrian remained on the floor, heart pounding with the realization that this venture was not only about rebuilding his life, it was about building a life with her. And though he had lost everything in Sophie's quiet dream, he had found the first glimpse of a future worth fighting for. Autumn crept into the city, bringing crisp air that carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and damp leaves along the sidewalks of Brooklyn. Adrian and Sophie had been working together for months now, their evenings consumed by lesson plans and budget discussions, their mornings filled with the laughter of children whose voices echoed through the narrow halls of the community center. The little program had begun to take root, and with it so had something neither of them dared to speak aloud. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Sophie suggested they take a walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. The city glittered around them, skyscrapers shimmering like beacons, the East River below catching fragments of light. Sophie hugged her thin coat tighter against the wind, shivering slightly. Without a word, Adrian slipped off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, startled. "You will be cold." He shook his head, eyes steady on hers. "I have been colder." Sophie smiled faintly, pulling the fabric around her. "Thank you." They walked slowly, their footsteps echoing on the wooden planks, surrounded by tourists taking photos and cyclists rushing past. For a while they said nothing, content in the rhythm of each other's presence. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "Why are you helping me, Adrian? You could be anywhere else, rebuilding your empire, fighting for your name. Instead, you are here painting walls and teaching children's art classes." Adrian stopped, resting his hands on the railing, gazing at the skyline. "Because when I lost everything, I thought I was useless. And then I met you. You reminded me I am not." His words hung in the air, carried away by the wind. Sophie's breath caught her heart beating too fast. She wanted to tell him what he had given her too. The confidence to believe her dreams mattered, the courage to think beyond survival, but the words tangled on her tongue. Instead, she stepped closer, so close that her shoulder brushed his arm. They stood like that, silent as the city pulsed around them. A young couple walked by, laughing, and Sophie glanced away, cheeks warming. Adrian noticed his chest tightening with a mix of fear and longing. He wanted to reach for her hand, but uncertainty bound him. He had been betrayed before destroyed by the illusion of love. Could he risk it again? The answer came unexpectedly a week later during one of their evening sessions. They were reviewing a stack of receipts when the power suddenly flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of streetlights through the window. Sophie gasped softly. Adrian pulled out his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam illuminated her face, her wide eyes, the small smile tugging at her lips, despite the inconvenience. "I guess we cannot finish the budget tonight," she said lightly. Adrian chuckled, the sound rare and warm. "No, but maybe we can finish a conversation we have been avoiding." Sophie tilted her head, heart racing. "What conversation?" Adrian lowered the phone slightly, shadows softening his features. "The one about what we mean to each other." Her lips parted, words frozen. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence filled with unspoken truths. Then slowly, Adrian reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. Sophie did not pull away. Instead, she turned her hand, letting his palm settle against hers. The contact was electric, grounding, and dizzying all at once. Adrian's voice was low, almost reverent. "I do not know what this is becoming, but I know I cannot imagine this without you." Sophie's eyes shimmered. "I was afraid to say it first." Their hands tightened the darkness around them, making the connection feel sacred. They sat like that until the lights flickered back on, startling them apart. Yet the spell was not broken. From that night on, something shifted. Their laughter carried a new warmth, their silences a deeper intimacy. Adrian found excuses to linger close, to brush her arm, when passing papers, to hold her gaze longer than necessary. Sophie caught herself humming when she prepared his coffee, her chest fluttering whenever he smiled. One chilly evening, they took the children to a park for an outdoor art class. As the kids painted the skyline, Adrian and Sophie stood nearby, sharing a thermos of cocoa. When a gust of wind sent Sophie's hair flying, Adrian reached to tuck a strand behind her ear. She froze, eyes lifting to his, and for a heartbeat the world fell away. Then a child called her name, and the moment passed, but the memory lingered burning quietly between them. Late one night, as they closed up the center, Sophie paused at the doorway. "Do you ever think about the future, Adrian?" He looked at her, understanding the weight beneath her words. "Every day," he admitted. "And lately all my thoughts of the future have you in them." Sophie's chest tightened, tears pricking her eyes. She wanted to speak, but emotion caught her throat. Instead, she stepped forward, slipping her hand into his. This time he did not hesitate. Fingers intertwined, they walked out into the night together, the city lights blazing above them like silent witnesses. Neither declared love yet, but both knew. It was there, fragile and fierce, blossoming in the cracks of their broken pasts. And as they walked, their shadows merging on the pavement, it became clear that what had begun in the rain was now taking root in something far stronger, the beginning of true love. The first whispers of success began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Local journalists wrote about the small but growing program. Donors started to ask questions, and parents expressed gratitude for a place that felt safe and full of hope. Adrian and Sophie were no longer two dreamers scribbling plans in a cafe. They were leaders of something that was beginning to matter. But with recognition came shadows. Cassandra returned like a storm cloud over a clear sky. She arrived at a gala one evening, the kind Adrian once frequented, her entrance marked by the flash of cameras and the echo of her sharp laughter. She sought him out deliberately, as if to remind him that she still knew how to control the boardroom of his life. When they finally faced each other, her eyes glimmered with amusement. "Adrian, darling, I see. You have traded skyscrapers for crayons. How noble." Her words sliced through him, but he held his ground. Cassandra leaned closer, her perfume sharp, familiar, and toxic. "You do not belong there teaching children. You belong here with me at the top where you built your name." Adrian stared at her in anger pulsing, but before he could speak, she pressed further. "Come back. The board will listen if you return. We can rebuild everything. Forget the girl." He stiffened at her words, the venomous dismissal of Sophie burning hotter than any insult. She saw the flicker in his eyes and smirked. "You think she cares for you? She cares for your attention, for your mind, maybe even your broken charm. But she will never understand what it takes to survive in this world. Only I understand." Adrian walked away without answering, but Cassandra's voice followed him like poison. "Think carefully. You cannot stay hidden forever." The next day he found Sophie at the center, kneeling among children who showed her messy finger paintings. She looked up, her face radiant with joy, and Adrian felt his conviction return. But Cassandra's temptation lingered in his thoughts like a ghost. That night, as he and Sophie reviewed plans, he grew distracted. Sophie noticed. "What happened, Adrian? You are somewhere else." He hesitated, torn between honesty and the instinct to protect her from Cassandra's venom. Finally, he admitted, "Cassandra wants me to come back. She thinks I should abandon this." Sophie's face paled, her smile fading. "And what do you think?" Adrian struggled. "Part of me wants to crush her to prove I can still rule the world she stole from me. But then I look at this place, at you, and I know that would mean losing the only thing that has felt real in years. Sophie's heart raced at his words, but fear shadowed her joy. Do you really mean that? Or are you saying what you think I want to hear? Adrian reached for her hand, but she pulled back slightly, uncertainty clouding her eyes. The doubt stung. He left that night without resolution. Cassandra's offer loomed larger when investors who once ignored him began to call. They offered money influence a chance to rebrand himself. All he had to do was walk away from Sophie's fragile dream. Temptation gnawed at him. For weeks he balanced on a knife's edge, torn between the glitter of his old world and the fragile beauty of his new one. Sophie sensed the distance growing. She found him staring at old photographs, his jaw clenched, his eyes haunted. One evening she confronted him. "If you want to go back to her, just say it. Do not string me along." Adrian froze. "I do not want her." Sophie's voice cracked. "Then why do I feel like I am losing you?" He tried to answer, but the words failed. She shook her head, tears brimming, and walked away. That night, Adrian sat alone in the cafe booth, the same place where Sophie had first offered him warmth. The rain tapped against the windows, echoing the night they had met. He realized Cassandra was right about one thing: he could not stay hidden forever. But she was wrong about everything else. Because survival was not about power, it was about love. Still, Sophie's absence cut deeper than he expected. Days passed without her voice steadying him, without her smile grounding him. He attended meetings with investors, their promises ringing in his ears. But every time he considered signing a deal, he saw Sophie's eyes filled with hurt. Cassandra appeared again, smug, confident, whispering promises of restoration. She leaned close at one meeting, murmuring, "You can have it all back, Adrian. The company, the influence, the respect. Just leave the girl behind." His silence was her victory, or so she thought. Adrian left the meeting torn in two, knowing he could no longer delay the inevitable. He had to choose. Late one evening, as he walked past the darkened community center, he saw the lights still on. Through the window, he spotted Sophie cleaning brushes, her face weary but determined. He pressed his hand against the glass, watching her. In that moment, he knew no empire could compare to this woman, to her resilience, to the way she had believed in him when no one else had. But Sophie did not see him. She turned off the lights and left unaware that Adrian's choice had already begun to form. The temptation remained sharp, but the love he felt was sharper. The stage was set for a decision that would define not only his career, but his heart. And the world, with Cassandra watching and Sophie doubting, waited for him to choose which future he would claim. The night of the charity gala arrived with the kind of glittering spectacle Adrian had once known by heart. Chandeliers dripped with crystal-light champagne flutes clinked, and the city's most powerful figures paraded in gowns and tailored suits, their laughter rising like music above the orchestra. It was the same stage where he had once been celebrated as a prodigy, the same circles that had discarded him without mercy. Now he was invited again, whispered about, judged and tested. The investors had promised this event would mark his return, a chance to cleanse his name. Cassandra glided through the crowd like a queen returning to her throne. Her dress shimmered gold, her smile sharp enough to wound. She sought him out instantly, slipping her arm through his as cameras flashed. The room buzzed with curiosity. Perhaps Adrian Cole was ready to reclaim his empire at her side. Cassandra leaned close, her words like poison wrapped in silk. Say the word tonight, and everything is yours again. The company, the board, the power. All you must do is walk away from that silly project, and that girl who thinks crayons can change the world. Adrian's chest tightened, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching. And then he saw her. Sophie stood near the back of the hall, awkward in a borrowed dress, too simple for the grandeur of the evening. Her hands clutched the strap of her purse, her gaze uncertain as she watched him beside Cassandra. For a moment his heart fractured. He could almost feel the distance widening, the trust he had nearly destroyed by hesitation. Sophie looked as though she did not belong here yet to him. She was the only person who ever truly belonged by his side. The speeches began, donors applauding polished words of charity, while checks exchanged hands. Adrian's name was called to the stage. The crowd erupted in applause, tinged with curiosity. Would he renounce his disgrace and step back into the empire he once commanded? Or would he cling to the fragile dream built with Sophie? He walked slowly to the podium, Cassandra smiling proudly as though victory was already hers. He looked out over the glittering room, his reflection caught in endless champagne bubbles. And for a moment he felt the pull of old ambition. But then his eyes found Sophie, standing small and silent, and the noise around him dimmed. He gripped the edges of the podium. For years I believed success was measured by numbers, by towers of glass, by the size of the empire bearing my name. And I believed love was a contract, a performance of appearances. He paused, his gaze steady on Cassandra, whose smile faltered. I was wrong. True success is not measured in billions. It is measured in impact, in lives changed, in hope restored. And true love. His voice softened, his eyes locking on Sophie. True love is not built on betrayal or ambition. It is built on honesty, on faith, on the courage to stand beside someone when the world walks away. A hush fell over the room. Adrian straightened. I will not return to the company. I will not abandon the project that has given my life meaning again. And I will not let the woman who betrayed me dictate the man I become. The crowd gasped. Cassandra's face twisted in disbelief, her carefully arranged smile crumbling into fury. Adrian stepped away from the podium, the cameras flashing wildly. But he did not stop there. He walked straight through the crowd toward the back where Sophie stood frozen. Her eyes were wide, tears threatening to spill, as though she could not quite believe what she had heard. Adrian stopped before her, every gaze in the room pinned to them. Sophie, you showed me what true love means. You believed in me when no one else did. You gave me back my heart. I will never choose power over you. He reached for her hand. Will you stand with me, not just tonight, but in every tomorrow? Sophie trembled, her lips parting as the silence in the hall awakened everyone holding their breath. She nodded, a tear slipping free, and whispered, yes. Adrian pulled her into his arms, and the room erupted in applause. Not the polite kind reserved for speeches, but the thunderous kind reserved for triumph. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, investors murmured in shock, and Cassandra fled the stage in humiliation, her empire of deceit unraveling before her. Adrian held Sophie tightly, his voice low against her hair. You saved me. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. No, Adrian, we saved each other. Their kiss was soft but resolute, a seal of the choice he had made, the choice that had finally freed him. Around them, the gala continued. But for Adrian and Sophie, The world had narrowed to two hearts that had found each other in the storm and chosen to never let go again. 1 year later, the city carried a different rhythm for Adrian Cole and Sophie Miller. The skyscrapers still shimmered with greed and ambition, but somewhere between them stood a modest brick building with bright murals painted by children. Its door carried a simple sign dressed out link, and within those walls lived a miracle born not of wealth but of resilience and love. Adrian walked through the halls as children laughed crayons scattered across tables. A piano played slightly off-key in the corner. He paused to watch Sophie kneel beside a girl struggling with a drawing, her gentle encouragement lighting the child's eyes with pride. That sight never failed to undo him. He had once thought the measure of success was how loudly the world applauded, how many billions flickered on a screen. Now he knew success was a boy's first confident word, read aloud a girl's painting proudly taped to the wall, a mother smiling with relief because her child was safe while she worked a night shift. Harvest Link had grown beyond their dreams. Local businesses donated food, teachers volunteered lessons, and a small network of sponsors pledged steady funding. Adrian, once scorned as reckless, now appeared in articles as the man who rebuilt his life, not with steel and glass, but with compassion. The media no longer called Sophie a poor waitress. They called her co-founder visionary heart of the program. Still she laughed when she read the words, shrugging as though they belonged to someone else. To Adrian, however, they had always been true. One evening, as summer gave way to autumn, Adrian and Sophie walked through the city together. The air was cool, the streets alive with chatter. They stopped at the cafe where it all began. It had changed little, the same chipped booths, the same hum of neon. Adrian ordered 2 coffees, insisting on paying with bills crumpled in his pocket, rather than a corporate card. When Sophie teased him about it, he only smiled. "This place saved me," he said. "Not the coffee, not the booth. You." She blushed, looking down into her cup. "You give me too much credit." "No," Adrian replied firmly. "I used to think power made me strong. Then I lost it all and met you, and you showed me what strength really is." Sophie lifted her gaze, her chest tightening with emotion. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. Opening it revealed a ring simple yet elegant, a sapphire glinting beneath the cafe lights. Sophie's breath caught. Adrian's voice softened. "I do not want a life measured by empires. I want a life measured by mornings with you, by laughter of children, by love that never betrays. Will you marry me, Sophie?" Tears filled her eyes as she whispered yes. The cafe seemed to glow brighter, the rain, starting lightly outside, as if to echo their first meeting. Months later, their wedding was intimate, held in the garden behind the community center. Children carried flowers, volunteers strung lights, and the vows they exchanged were not grand but honest. Adrian promised to choose love over power. Sophie promised to never let him forget who he truly was. When they kissed, it was not before cameras or shareholders, but before a family they had built from strangers and dreams. In the years that followed, Harvest Link expanded across the city, then to other states. Each location bore the mark of their journey, painted walls bright, with children's art doors open to anyone in need. Adrian often stood back during celebrations, watching Sophie laugh with parents. Her joy unguarded, her compassion endless. In those moments he thought of Cassandra, of the empire he had lost, and felt nothing but gratitude. Because without betrayal, he never would have found the truth. Without ruin, he never would have met Sophie. On the anniversary of their first meeting, the rain returned to Manhattan, soft and persistent. Adrian and Sophie walked together beneath a single umbrella hand in hand. They paused at the corner where it all began, the memory vivid, the soaked suit, the trembling umbrella, the voice that had cut through despair. Adrian turned to Sophie, smiling gently. "I thought that night was the end of me." Sophie squeezed his hand. It was the beginning. He kissed her there on the corner beneath the rain, unafraid of the world watching. For he had learned that love, true love, is the only empire worth building, the only treasure that cannot be sold or stolen. And as they walked away together, laughter mingling with raindrops, it was clear to anyone who saw them that Adrian Cole had lost everything once, but in Sophie Miller he had found the one thing money could never buy: true love.